September 12, 1944. By 0800, the Pacific sun was already brutal when Major Robert Cowboy, Stout, climbed into the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat aboard the USS Hornet. The carrier deck was organized chaos. Deck crews in colored jerseys darting between aircraft, the sharp tang of aviation, fuel mixing with salt air, and the constant roar of engines warming for the day's missions. Stout had flown 63 combat sorties by then, but something about this morning sat heavy in his gut. The intelligence briefings the night before had been vague, almost dismissive. The target was Peleliu, a speck of coral and jungle in the Palau Islands, most Americans had never heard of. In 3 days, 15,000 Marines were supposed to storm those beaches in what commanders promised would be a quick 3-day operation. Spoiler, it would take 2 months and cost nearly 10,000 casualties, but Stout didn't know that yet. His assignment looked simple on paper: fly reconnaissance over the northern airfields, snap photographs, and report back so the brass could confirm Japanese air power was minimal. Earlier reconnaissance had called the airfields abandoned or lightly held. Stout's job seemed like a routine box-checking flight, one of those milk runs where the worst danger was nodding off on the long trip home. Except intelligence was catastrophically wrong. Approaching Peleliu from the east at 8,000 feet and running his standard photo run protocol, straight and level, while the cockpit-mounted camera automatically captured overlapping frames, he saw something that froze his blood and simultaneously slammed his tactical mind into overdrive. The airfield was not abandoned. It was packed, rows upon rows of Japanese aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on the tarmac like sardines in a can. Mitsubishi A6M0s that had dominated the early war, Nakajima B-5N torpedo planes, HED-3A dive bombers, all fueled, all armed, all poised to shred the invasion fleet, steaming toward Peleliu at that very moment. Stout's combat experience let him estimate numbers fast: 40 planes minimum, maybe more, tucked under camouflage netting by the jungle edge. This was not a token defensive detail, but a strike group positioned and ready to launch a devastating attack on the American ships just over the horizon. If those aircraft got airborne during the landing, they would cut through vulnerable transport ships carrying Marines. Thousands could die in the water before hitting the beach, and the whole operation could collapse into a bloodbath that would make Tarawa look like a practice drill. His radio crackled with routine check-ins from other pilots, voices calm and professional. Stout's thumb hovered above the transmit button. Protocol demanded he radio this in immediately, break away, and let the fleet scramble a coordinated strike package. But by the time he'd flown back, filed a report, and convinced skeptical intelligence officers that they'd missed an entire airfield, precious hours would burn away. The Japanese might disperse the planes, hide them in revetments, or, worse, launch them against the fleet. Right then they were sitting ducks, exposed, and likely waiting for dawn reconnaissance to pinpoint the invasion fleet's position before launching their assault. He made another pass, dropping to 3,000 feet for a closer look, his photographer's eye cataloguing every detail even as fighter instincts screamed warnings about anti-aircraft positions. The airfield stretched along Peleliu's northern coast, a single runway carved from coral and jungle with dispersal areas fanning out on both sides. What snagged his attention wasn't just the number of planes but how they were arranged. Someone on the ground had made a fatal error, probably hurried by the urgency of prepping for their own strike. The aircraft sat in tight, neat rows barely 15 feet apart, where standard practice would have them spread, hidden under trees or protected behind revetments. Instead, they looked lined up for inspection at flight school. Through his canopy he could see ground crews in tiny khaki figures rolling fuel drums, carrying belts of ammunition, running pre-flight checks. They had no idea an American fighter was circling above. Why would they? Early warning radar in that sector was primitive, and single aircraft reconnaissance flights were common enough they rarely triggered a full alert. The complacency was almost palpable from 3,000 feet. Those crews thought they owned the sky, and that they had time. Stout's tactical mind spun faster. Trained in ground attack at Pensacola, he'd spent weeks practicing strafing runs against target sleds and painted truck hulks. Doctrine was simple: come in low and fast, hit the target in a single devastating pass, then get out before ground fire could track you. But Doctrine assumed you attacked one or two targets, not an entire airbase. His Hellcat carried .50 caliber machine guns in the wings, 3 per side, each gun loaded with 400 rounds, giving him 2,400 rounds total. At the Browning M2's cyclic rate of about 750 rounds per minute, he could sustain roughly 12 seconds of continuous fire before running dry, 12 seconds to destroy 40 planes. The math didn't work by conventional reckoning. Yet the layout changed everything. The planes weren't merely close, they were parked beside their fuel supplies, drums stacked next to each aircraft, high-octane gasoline waiting to be pumped into tanks for the morning strike. One tracer into a drum would turn it into a bomb, one burning aircraft would spread flame to its neighbors. The Japanese had, through haste or oversight, created a massive chain reaction waiting to be set off. This wouldn't be about shooting down 40 airplanes one by one, it would be about lighting a fuse and letting thermodynamics and conflagration do the rest. He checked fuel and ammo carefully, enough fuel for the strike and the return with reasonable reserves, full ammunition on all 6 guns. The Hellcat felt solid and responsive beneath him, a trusted mount that had carried him through 63 missions, but trust didn't erase danger. Hidden in the surrounding jungle, Japanese anti-aircraft positions, Type 96 25mm autocannons, the standard light AA were waiting, fingers on triggers. Once he made his first pass and those machine guns started barking, every gun on the island would open up. He would be alone, unsupported, flying into a storm of steel with no wingman and no rescue if he went down. The decision point sharpened with absolute clarity. Every second spent circling was another second. Those aircraft remained ready to kill American sailors and Marines. He could radio back, wait for orders, and watch a proper strike package, fighters, dive bombers, coordinated naval aviation, assemble, but that would take at least 90 minutes, probably closer to 2 hours with briefings and launch sequences. By then Japanese spotters would have reported the fleet's position, and those 40 aircraft would be scattered and airborne, and the window would slam shut. Military doctrine existed for reasons: coordination saved lives, overwhelming force minimized risk, careful planning prevented disaster. Stout had sat through the lectures and absorbed the rules about never engaging without support. But doctrine could not cover every moment. Sometimes war handed you a unique convergence outside the rulebook, a one-time opportunity that would never repeat. This was that moment: 40 enemy planes packed like ammunition in a magazine, completely vulnerable and capable of changing the entire course of the Pleiden invasion, if left intact, and one man in a Hellcat hovering above with a choice to make. The rational part of Stout's brain ran through every way this could end in minutes. Anti-aircraft fire, shredding his Hellcat on the first pass, and cartwheeling him into the jungle, in a ball of flame, a lucky round severing hydraulic lines and leaving him helpless, guns jamming in the humid Pacific air, a misjudged altitude sending him plowing into the coral at 300 miles an hour. Any of which meant dying alone on a nameless island, his body never recovered, and his family receiving the antiseptic telegram: missing in action, presumed dead. But the converse was as stark. If those Japanese planes launched, the slow, vulnerable transports carrying Marines and their kit would become floating coffins under torpedo and dive bomber attack. Stout had watched footage and heard the radioed desperation of pilots who arrived too late, as ships exploded and sank, and he would not let that happen when he had the power to prevent it, and 40 enemy aircraft sat beneath him like practice targets. There was something else too, the pure tactical opportunity of it all. A fantasy of fighters turned real, perfect enemy positioning, a terrible operational error to be exploited before it could be fixed. His hand went to the throttle. The Hellcat's Pratt and Whitney answered with a throat-deep roar from 18 cylinders and 2,000 horsepower as he nosed down, abandoning reconnaissance and radio calls. 30 seconds now separated him from legend or statistic. He pushed through 1,500 feet, and then leveled out at 50 feet above the treetops. So low palm fronds whipped in his prop wash, and most AA gunners would struggle to track him. The airfield rushed up. He had seconds to set his geometry. The rows of Japanese aircraft lay northeast, southwest, parallel to the runway, so Stout chose an approach perpendicular to those rows to cut across multiple lines in one pass. More targets in the cone of his guns, more chances to start the chain reaction he was counting on. Cleared of the last line of jungle at 310 miles per hour, the airfield became a shooting gallery in which individual details snapped into view. Ground crews looking up in that split second between confusion and panic, fuel drums stacked 3 high beside each plane, a Zero with its cowling open and maintenance still in progress. His thumb found the firing button. The .50 caliber Brownings, synchronized to converge about 300 yards ahead, would throw an armor-piercing, incendiary mix that could rip skin and ignite fuel systems. He pressed, and the Hellcat shuddered as all 6 guns spat death together, tracers arcing, every 5th round a glowing guide to walk fire onto the target, and he aimed for the gap between 2 Zeros where drums clustered. Rounds scoured the coral, kicked white dust, then tore into a Zero's fuselage, metal peeled like tissue. 2 seconds of sustained fire, roughly 25 rounds per gun, 150 rounds, and then a slight left correction. A fuel drum detonated, not in isolation but in a cascading choreography that sent an orange fireball through a wing tank and into a secondary blast that sprayed burning fuel across adjacent aircraft. Stout's tracers hammered a Nakajima torpedo bomber next. When that hulking fuel-laden plane detonated, the shockwave buffeted his Hellcat, even as he screamed past at 300 miles per hour. 4 seconds into the run, and halfway across the field, fires raced outward, aircraft parked too close, fuel-feeding flames under a heat that made aluminum fail, and wing tanks rupture before the fire even reached them, dumping hundreds of gallons that flash-ignited into rivers across the tarmac. Ground crews scattered, men diving into drainage ditches, others futilely beating at flames with jackets, while anti-aircraft positions began firing blindly into smoke and confusion, their muzzle flashes flickering but their aim ruined by chaos. Stout kept the trigger depressed, sweeping the 3rd and 4th rows. Dive bombers with thin aluminum skins offered no shelter from armor-piercing rounds, and one loaded bomber's ordnance detonated in a catastrophic eruption that mushroomed black smoke skyward, shrapnel shredding 2 Zeros into twisted wrecks and peppering Stout's canopy with fragments. What began as surgical attacks on fuel drums erupted into an uncontrolled conflagration. Burning gasoline pooled and ran with the runway's slight grade. Ammunition cooked off inside stricken fighters, machine gun belts, 20mm cannon shells, even small bombs, each secondary blast feeding more fire and scattering lethal shrapnel. Thick black plumes climbed high enough to be visible from the carrier task force 50 miles away. A fuel truck servicing the bombers took a burst and flipped, dumping another 1,000 gallons into the blaze and multiplying the inferno. The thermal wave became palpable even at 300 miles per hour, shimmering the air and distorting his vision. By the time he was past the field, his ammo counters had wound down, roughly half his load spent, about 1,200 rounds gone, but the destruction had escalated beyond what bullets alone could do. So the enemy had, through concentrated fuel stocks, tightly packed aircraft, inadequate fire suppression, and probably minimal ground crew training for this scale of emergency, created a perfect storm of vulnerability, and Stout had lit the fuse. Disaster. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong for them, and Major Robert Cowboy Stout was the catalyst that had set it all in motion. Pulling up sharply at the end of the airfield, he climbed to 500 feet to assess the damage and plan his next move. Anti-aircraft fire was intensifying now, black puffs of 25mm shells bursting around his Hellcat as the gunners finally found their range. Tracers from light machine guns arced up from multiple positions, weaving a deadly web of fire he had to cut through. The Japanese were panicking, firing at anything that moved, their aim ruined by fear and smoke. Stout banked hard right, using his altitude advantage to stay beyond the envelope of the heaviest ground fire while he took stock of his work. The northern section of the airfield was a roaring inferno, at least 15 aircraft burning or destroyed, blackened skeletons where planes had once stood. But the southern section still had targets, another 20 to 25 aircraft untouched, some being desperately taxied away from the flames, exactly the wrong thing to do. They had turned stationary targets into moving ones, harder to hit but just as vulnerable. Stout grinned behind his oxygen mask. They were making his job easier. He pushed the stick forward and lined up for a second run. This time would be different. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by a fully alerted enemy who had watched their airfield turned into a crematorium. Every anti-aircraft gun on Peleliu was tracking him now, crews frantically cranking elevation wheels and leading his flight path. Smoke billowed upward, thick black columns rising thousands of feet, obscuring targets and creating turbulence that made precision flying nearly impossible. But the remaining aircraft in the southern dispersal area were still a threat. He couldn't leave them intact. Approaching from the southeast instead of retracing his first run, he followed a basic survival rule: never attack from the same angle twice. His airspeed was slightly lower, around 280 miles per hour, for better target resolution, though it made him more vulnerable. At 310 miles per hour, everything blurred. At 280, he could pick targets and make every round count. Ammunition was running low, about 800 rounds left across 6 guns, barely 6 seconds of fire. The anti-aircraft barrage had become a light show of death. Tracers crisscrossed his path, some streaking so close he could see the glow through his canopy. A 25mm shell burst 30 feet to his left, shrapnel rattling against his fuselage. Another exploded dead ahead, forcing him to jink right and spoil his aim. The Japanese gunners were improving fast, adjusting for speed and altitude, creating kill boxes he had to weave through. Stout's training kicked in: never fly straight for more than 2 seconds, always change something. He opened fire on a group of 5 Zeros taxiing toward the jungle. His tracers raked the lead aircraft from propeller to tail, the fuel tank erupting in flame as the pilot bailed out, his suit ablaze. The Zero rolled to a stop, another torch for the inferno. Stout shifted aim and struck the second, rounds tearing through its engine, coolant spraying white as it seized. 3 more bursts destroyed 2 additional planes. The 5th barely reached the tree line before a lucky hit sent it crashing nose first into the jungle. His portside guns clicked empty, 3 Brownings dry. Only his starboard guns remained, maybe 300 rounds, but the imbalance made aiming difficult, the recoil pulling left. He compensated with rudder, found 2 dive bombers near a camouflaged revetment, and stitched both with fire. One exploded instantly, the other leaked fuel until the flames reached it and blew both sky high in a double blast. Then something slammed into his Hellcat's tail, jolting the aircraft. Stout's eyes darted to the instrument panel: oil pressure steady, hydraulics good, controls responsive. Whatever hit him hadn't crippled the plane, but it was a harsh reminder his luck couldn't hold. Every second over the airfield was another roll of the dice. He squeezed off his last burst at a fuel truck near the runway. It went up in flames, and Stout pulled hard for open ocean. His remaining guns ran dry, 2,400 rounds, expended in roughly 15 seconds of total firetime over 2 passes. Behind him, Peleliu's airfield was dying. Climbing to safety, Stout risked a glance back, and the sight was unreal in its completeness. The northern section was an inferno, columns of black smoke merging into a single pillar rising 10,000 feet into the tropical sky. The southern half was nearly as bad, most aircraft burning or destroyed, feeding the apocalyptic blaze. Even from 5 miles out, the heat shimmered like a mirage. Ground crews had abandoned firefighting, focused only on surviving the detonations of cooking ammunition. The tactical impact was staggering. As Stout's adrenaline ebbed, his mind shifted to the broader picture: 40 Japanese aircraft destroyed or crippled in 8 minutes. It wasn't just a successful strike, it was the annihilation of Japanese air power in the Peleliu sector. Those planes had been the planned counter to the coming American invasion. Without them, the Japanese garrison was blind and helpless. When the Marines landed on September 15, 3 days later, they would have absolute air superiority from the first wave. The math was simple and brutal. Each torpedo bomber could have sunk a transport ship carrying 500 Marines. Even half the Japanese force could have turned a bay into a graveyard. But Stout had changed all that. Major Robert Cowboy Stout, had single-handedly prevented a nightmare scenario. The Marines who would storm the beaches of Peleliu would never know his name, never realize that their unopposed landing was possible, because one pilot had decided to attack an entire airbase alone, but they would live because of it. That was the calculus of war. Invisible chains of cause and effect, where a single action could ripple outward to save or doom thousands. Strategically, the consequences were enormous. Japanese commanders across the Palau Islands had been depending on those aircraft for both offense and defense. Without them, the balance of the entire theater shifted. American carriers could move closer to shore, providing better close air support for the Marines. Recon planes could map Japanese positions without fear of fighters. Supply ships could reach the beaches unmolested. One daring strafing run had changed the operational landscape of the entire Peleliu campaign. Yet Stout, with the clear-eyed realism of a combat veteran, knew that air superiority wouldn't make Peleliu easy. The island's 11,000-man garrison was entrenched in coral ridges and limestone caves, fortifications no bomb could erase. The ground battle would be savage, fought cave by cave, ridge by ridge, among the bloodiest in the Pacific. His attack had removed one danger, but not the brutal reality that Peleliu was a fortress that would demand a terrible cost. Still, every Marine who survived the landing because enemy aircraft weren't strafing them would be a victory worth the risk. His fuel gauge was dropping fast. High-speed passes and combat maneuvers had burned through his reserves. Stout pointed his Hellcat's nose toward the coordinates of the USS Hornet and climbed steadily. The hole in his tail created drag, making the aircraft tail-heavy, but he trimmed it out. The radio crackled with excited chatter, pilots reporting the smoke rising from Peleliu, carrier controllers demanding answers. Confusion spread through the fleet. Stout keyed his mic and gave the most understated report of his life. Hornet Control, this is Stout. Mission complete. Peleliu Airfield neutralized. Returning to base. The radio was silent for several seconds before the incredulous response came. Say again your last, Stout. Did you say neutralized? He smiled. Affirmative. The airfield is no longer operational. You'll want to scramble a photo bird for documentation. Out. 40 minutes later, his Hellcat slammed onto the Hornet's deck, tailhook catching the third wire. The deck crew swarmed the battered fighter, stunned by the damage, shrapnel-torn tail, hydraulic streaks, scorch marks from his own explosions. His plane captain climbed up, stared at the empty ammunition counters, then back at Stout. Word spread fast. The man responsible for the towering smoke column, visible 50 miles away, had just landed. By the time Stout's boots hit the deck, a crowd had gathered. The intelligence debrief lasted 3 hours. Stout sat in the ready room surrounded by maps, calmly recounting every detail while reconnaissance photos confirmed his claims. 40 aircraft reduced to burned-out wrecks, the airfield cratered and aflame. The officers kept asking the same questions, as if to convince themselves it was possible. How many passes? 2. Ammunition? All of it. Were you hit? Yes. But nothing critical. Wingmen? None. Eventually, silence replaced interrogation, a mix of awe and disbelief. The Navy awarded him the Navy Cross for the mission, citing his extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in aerial combat against enemy Japanese forces. But official recognition came months later, after dozens more missions and countless battles. Stout rarely spoke of Peleliu afterward. Among the swagger and story-swapping of carrier pilots, his modesty stood out. He had done something truly extraordinary yet seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. When the war ended in 1945, Stout returned to civilian life. He settled quietly in California, worked in the booming aerospace industry, raised a family, and lived a life that appeared ordinary from the outside. He seldom mentioned his combat record. Even his children barely knew their father had been a decorated Navy pilot. Only decades later, as historians began revisiting forgotten Pacific operations, did Stout's Peleliu mission gain the recognition it deserved. Researchers uncovered after-action reports and carrier logs confirming that his solo strike ranked among the most devastating single-pilot attacks in aviation history. Its influence endured. Military academies studied his mission as a case study in exploiting enemy errors and creating cascading operational effects. His decision to act on a fleeting opportunity, even beyond his original orders, became a model of initiative for future officers. It proved that, under the right conditions, one pilot with skill, courage, and luck could change the course of a battle. Robert Cowboy Stout passed away in 1989 at 73, having lived to see the Cold War end and the doctrines he helped inspire become standard. His obituary mentioned his Navy service only briefly, focusing instead on his family and career. Most who attended his funeral had no idea that the quiet man they'd known had once destroyed an entire enemy airbase in 8 minutes of combat over a forgotten Pacific island. But the Marines who landed on Peleliu on September 15, 1944, and lived because Japanese planes never came, owed their lives to the decision of one pilot who, in a single moment of courage, chose to dive into hell. That was the legacy that mattered. Not medals or citations, but the thousands who came home because Robert Cowboy Stout believed some chances only come once, and some risks are worth taking. You said, that was the legacy that mattered, not in medals, not in records, but in the thousands of men who came home alive because Major Robert Cowboy Stout chose to act when no one else could. His courage turned the tide of a battle, his instincts changed the course of a war, and his story reminds us that sometimes one man's decision can alter history forever. If you enjoyed this story of bravery and forgotten heroism, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more untold tales of valor from World War II. Your support helps us keep these incredible stories alive, stories of courage, sacrifice, and the people who shaped history one mission at a time.